Welcome, dear guests, at the third
Канал
tete-a-tete
про права людини Docudays UA.
Docudays
Сьогодні ми обговорюємо третій фільм національного конкурсу «Май далеко, май добре» Ганни Ярошевич, яка з нами зараз.
As Far As Possible by Ganna Iaroshevych, and I would like to remind to those who first joined this series of the interview that the film premiere will have its own premiere, and you will have access to it on DocuSpace platform at 8 p.m. and it will be available until the end of the festival. But the number of views is limited to 600, and during this interview and until the end of the festival, you can ask Ganna questions either today or via messages in the comments on the Facebook as per practice. So, Hanna, congratulations on the premiere. As I understand, this is a world premiere online, as everything that happens today in the world. And I would like to begin with the basics. In the interview that I think you gave for the Docudays website, you decided to film Michel. When you read his interview on the website, and whether you were looking for the topic for the next project and you came across this one, or maybe it was completely a different way. Yes, indeed. It started with the interview. This was Bogdan Lugmanenko who established this project, and he traveled all across Ukraine, meeting interesting people and documenting their stories on Facebook. And I saw one of those stories. I was studying at Sergei Bukovsky workshop, and just as everybody else, I wanted to make my debut film, and before that I was making short films, and I was in the search of a character for a feature-length film, and I read this material about Michel, and for a week or more I was thinking about the story. And I contacted him via email, telling him that I wanted to get to know him better, to make a film about him. I wasn't sure about the end result, so he was an open person, and I came with the DOP. And then we decided to turn it into a film. So what was really engaging in the story? I would say it was this atypical migration, because more often than not, people migrate from east to west, but Michel, while having a very affluent family in Germany, decided to go to Ukraine, and not to the capital city, but to a small village. And I wanted to delve deeper into the motives of this person and why Ukraine. All these questions pushed me into filming. And what was he doing when he was still living in Germany? Because we see a bit of a background, and the locals say that his father is one of the richest persons in the world. So how do you think he deals with his background? He is an ecologist, an environmentalist by profession. He has special education, and he was on an eco mission, and when he came to Ukraine, and when he comes to Germany, he works for his parents' company, It's a shipping company which works all over Europe, and I have difficulty understanding what he does specifically for a job. And as for his brother, well, his father was actually transferring all his responsibilities to him. And as for Michel, I don't think that even he himself understands what he does in this family business. But for him, this job is unclear. He has no background in economics, and he wasn't completely aware what he was doing. So we could say that this is the story of emancipation from a rich family, when the person feels trapped in the family with the established traditions that there is a family business, the company, but he felt as an outsider, sort of Breaking Bad only into ecology. And it was Michel's grandfather who established this company. And when it came to Michel and his brother, neither of them wanted to take over the reins of this company. And since he lived in Germany, he had trouble finding work, so he went to work for the family company. And now I think the company's no more, and they decided to go out of business because the father himself didn't see how his children would continue with this family business. It is indeed a very interesting story, and we could somehow establish a correlation with yesterday's film, because there was the story from the directors about what's happening in Donbass, how this industrialization destroys everything. And again, the protagonist in that film follows this golden path. So he tries to return and go back to nature. And I think this is his philosophy, and which is, I think, also holds true for Michel. He steps away from this path towards progress, and as a result, he decided to save the water buffalo population from extinction. And it's a very interesting story. And as far as I know, just as the two previous films that we've watched, this is a long project which took you, for example, 5 years. Yes, indeed. It's a long-running theme. We needed 5 years to do it. We had a 3-year break. So first, Michel lived in Ukraine. Then we met. Then we learned that he met a girl in Germany, and so that was a break. And he said that, yes, that's the news. I'm living in Germany in the house of my girlfriend. And we were quite surprised. That was a turn of events. And we decided to work with the materials that we've already filmed. And then, as fate would have it, we went to Germany. So the story in the Carpathian Mountains, that was a risky move. Yes, we Skyped together, and Michel told us about his life, about his girlfriend. Everything was logical, why he moved back there. And it took me a week of thinking, of trying to interpret it, and I was left with an impression that he wasn't happy in his present life. He sort of showed this his new house, his girlfriend, but I felt this doubt, internal doubt, whether he made the right choice. by returning back to Germany. And I didn't know what the ending would be. And my feeling was that he wouldn't stay there for long. So, nevertheless, in those 3 years, whether there were some radical changes, not in the idea, but in the way you decided to show the idea of the film because of his circumstances, what changed in the process, and when did you decide that you needed to go the other way? When we started, we didn't know whether he would meet someone, that it would be this specific girl, and I wasn't even sure that it would turn out a feature-length film. I knew that he lived in Ukraine, he had a wonderful mission, but I wasn't sure that people were ready to spend 1 hour of their life watching Michel and his buffaloes. But then there came a turn of events when he met this girl, and we saw the contrast between Ukraine and Germany, and we saw his doubts arising, and thus we understood that it won't be a movie about a specific person, but about life choices, about freedom. It seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that when we choose a topic or a setting for the film Carpathians, we risk to dwindle into some pastoral scenes and bucolic scenes. And so how do we step away from that? How do we deal with that so that the Carpathians and this village reality, which how do we try to balance that with our idea, with our underlying idea? This is indeed an awesome question, because when we came to trainings, to pitchings, they told us, you're not going to romanticize Ukraine and to turn Germany into something cold and frightening. Well, for my part, I tried to remain objective, because we didn't film only in winter, only on the peak of the mountain, where we could sort of deviate from our original idea. But this is the real life as it is, with some ugly moments. And for us, we just couldn't overdo it and to make it all about animals, the Carpathians, and the beauty of nature. And Michel saw one of the working drafts, and he just was sad because Ukraine wasn't beautiful and the buffaloes stood in the mud. And yes, well, it's not about buffaloes all standing all muddy. Well, for Michel, maybe those buffaloes are so pretty and fluffy. He doesn't even notice these ugly moments. Maybe he was worried about some tipsy people showing on the screen. He wanted to see it beautiful, but we didn't want to idealize Ukraine or to show it in a too horrible image. So I tried to be objective. You see, I was kind of afraid, anxious about this Michel's disappointment when he faces this hardcore reality that corruption never goes away, and there can be some moments which are not pretty. And you, in fact, portray one at one point when some farm worker didn't feed the animals and Michelle was angry. And you're sort of anticipating what's going to happen next, whether it will be something quite expected when he decides to quit and go back, or maybe he would go the other way. And so this sort of suspense remains. There is this temptation to push the audience into thinking about it in a specific way. So this cause and fact relations, how did you deal with that? No, we didn't want to influence the audience this way, and Michelle didn't react in such a predictable way. So when he saw drunk people, he was mad, and he, after that, just talked with buffaloes. He just looks at it differently, and in his eyes, Ukraine is astonishingly beautiful, and that's why we decided to add it and show it this way, to show Ukraine through his eyes, because it doesn't cause any conflict within him. There's no conflict between him and the people. So the problems in Ukraine look more like adventures for him. Ukraine is the kind of country where people can drink some alcohol for breakfast, some adventurous country, you know. And this is how we wanted to show it in the film. I think that there is this temptation when you're fascinated with your character, with his image, but when the time passes and this impression lets off, and you can swing the other way, so to say. Maybe you would want to set a specific background for this portrait that you're showing, because 5 years is a long time. It was difficult, indeed, because our relations with Michelle underwent a transformation, and he, in fact, changes not exactly his opinion, but he just changes his plans very often. Maybe it's this childish naivete, and it was difficult when we were reviewing what we filmed, and we couldn't make heads or tails of where exactly he's going. And for hours and hours on end, we, together with the directors of photography and producers, talked about his aim, his goal, and trying to reorganize it into one plot line. But we did not try to point the viewer, the audience, in a specific direction. And while I was watching the film, I decided to ask you about that. Halfway through into the film, I understood that I want to watch the film about his girlfriend, who comes together with her 2 children. And I want to have a look at her. And then you give the floor to her only through an interview. At what stage did you decide to introduce this into the plot? In fact, as it happened, we always filmed this girl together with Michelle, and then the moment came when this is going to be a spoiler, when their relationship started deteriorating and they didn't spend this much time together. And we understood that this is the turning point where we must give the floor to her, whether she sees the situation the same way as Michelle does. And then we came to her place. There was nobody there, and we didn't know any of her friends, and so we couldn't film it like a conversation between her and her friends. And this was the only way to find out her opinion. So this direct interview. I'm not a proponent of this technique, but with this girl, well, to introduce Michelle into that, for them to try to settle the score, no, that wouldn't be nice. Well, you can, of course, push your characters into doing something. So, but they were too far apart. So the interview was the only way out. So we weren't sure that she was going to agree to that. She didn't promise us anything, but we managed to establish a conversation with her. So she shared her opinions, and her emotions turned out to be very important for me, and that's how they got onto the screen. For me, this is a classical story, the story of a man who tries to shape the reality and adapt it to his own needs. And then the woman comes. She has her background, her family, her life. So, and then what does she have to do in this situation? So it was really interesting to look at it through her eyes. So we don't look at him from a one-sided perspective, so to say. And we already have one question coming up from Victoria Bonder. During all this time, did you have any misunderstandings with your character? In fact, our last filming was very difficult. This is almost the end of the movie when we came to Michelle in Ukraine. Maybe we came not at the best moment, not at the prettiest moment. And to top that, Michelle came back from Germany. He worked with his parents for 2 years, and of course he had shepherds in Ukraine. He kept close contact with them. He gave money, but there was no master to them, and everything started deteriorating. And of course, he could have told us to just come later, say in a fortnight, when the grass is green and the house is clean. But he'd been waiting for us, and when he saw what we were filming, he started worrying, because when in the morning we started filming, then he would spend half a day telling us not to film this, not to film that. We didn't want to have any arguments, such as and doing this hidden camera thing. We came to him, and in the evening I would understand that for the whole day we've been following Michelle, or maybe we just left our cameras and decided to carry hay around. So In fact, Michelle was, I think, wasn't even happy to see us. And in the epilogue, when I asked Michelle to film this or that, I was worried that he would tell us to stop, but fortunately he agreed to continue. But at that point in time, it was difficult. So if you film this portrait, how do you find a way out? Because it's quite risky to censor your own portrait. And as you said, that when he saw what you filmed, it seemed not so pretty to him. So what words did you use, as if in this mini masterclass? What do you say to your character? Just how do you convince them to step away? During the filming, he wasn't completely aware of that. So at some point, he started saying that you've been filming for so long, for 5 years. And I started again reiterating that this is the story about you, about your Germany, about your life in Ukraine. And maybe he thought that we wouldn't include that specific moment into the film. But when he saw that rough cut, we had a very difficult conversation. We spent a lot of time explaining during this 2-hour Skype call when I, and the producer, and Katya, and we, together with Michelle, we'd been talking, trying to convince him why this or that scene is important, why the film must be like that. Because we were in the final stages, and at some point we told him that we wouldn't change anything. But we wanted to have this conversation. Well, we didn't want to sort of mislead him. So it was important for us to explain to him why the film looks the way it is. We wanted to be objective. So in the end, you managed to convince him, because there is, in fact, artistic freedom. Indeed, in a month, he wrote back to us and asking to cut something out. So again, in a week, there was something else. There was this going back and forth for quite some time. But I wanted to keep a good relationship with him, and I wanted to have a good film. Which reminds me about the story about how to interview people, because the person, the interviewee, is a co-author of the interview. So the practical question here is, are there any legal leverages here to influence this person? When we filmed, we in fact signed a contract with Michel where he allowed us to film and show these materials at film festivals and platforms. We already had this legal safeguard in this document, because we filmed his girlfriend and her children, because legally in Germany it's even more complicated. We've been talking to him for hours, convincing him why this sin is important. We're not just trying to push that document under his nose. So Of course, you wouldn't want to create a scandal out of that. Yes, later on, you understand that when I was involved in journalism, you know that some things are cut out from the context. When you look at this, for example, table, you don't like it, so you cut it out. And since this is a documentary film, it's not. We don't do things intentionally, bringing some drunk people or showing buffaloes in the mud. This is real life, and it's not necessarily must be beautiful. It's maybe beautiful in its essence.
Yes, but I have to say, visually, this was a very compelling image, and this is not the only advantage of this film, but I have to mention definitely that it is also very aesthetically, visually pleasing. Continuing the conversation about the character, we have a nice, interesting question from Lisa van Dreyk, who asks if you think you have impacted in any way some of the decisions made by your character. Do you think you personally, and perhaps the presence of the camera, somehow influenced him, and would he have acted differently had you not been there? I think we have impacted him, definitely. When we arrived in Germany during that period when he was working for his parents, and we started shooting his lifestyle, I think up until then he had spent about half a year living with his girlfriend in Germany. But when we arrived, I think this was an opportunity for him to look at his life from a distance and to realize just how boring it is, just how far it is from what he wanted. We also had lots of conversations with him. I have to mention that he lived an hour away, an hour drives away from the office, so we would wake up at 5 o'clock in the morning and we would take the drive with him to work, and would take this time as an opportunity to have a conversation about life in Germany, about taxes, about his lifestyle. And these conversations with us, I think, the fact that he took an estranged view of his life, perhaps pushed him towards moving to Ukraine. It's not like he was immediately on the bags and moving, but I think it might have pushed him towards thinking about it more. What was the locals' reaction to you? Did they somehow impact, well, not the narrative, of course, but the environment around the film? How did you engage with the locals? The locals in Zakarpattia? Well, the locals in Ukraine, in Zakarpattia, they are mostly very nice people, I have to say, and we were in close touch with Michel's friends. They supported us very actively. We would spend the night at their places, we would take showers at their places, we would be invited to family celebrations and everything, and we really wanted to use his environment to enhance the social layer of his surroundings. But then we realized just how many friends he had, so we decided we wouldn't separate this into a subject line in itself, because there were so many of them. But they supported us, and we never ran into any obstacles, like with them not wanting to be shot, so it was fine. How would you evaluate his position in the community? My impression from the interview for Curator was that he is, well, first of all, reviving the tradition of rearing buffaloes and breeding them. So he has sort of restored this tradition, and you had these accents here that it had been destroyed by the Soviet period. So when he started doing this, how active was the community? To what extent did they feel a need for this sort of revival? Is he not fighting this war alone? He actually mentions in the film that no man is an island, so he brings the phrase up himself. So to what extent was he supported by this community that he arrived in? Well, he actually was supported by a great deal of people, and Michel has turned into a celebrity in this place where he lives. We once accompanied him into a bit of a walk, a cross-country walk. So he decided he would take his buffaloes to the Poloninas to rear them there, and we took 10 days to cross part of the Carpathian Mountains with him, and we met so many people on our path who knew Michel, who would be happy to see us, who would ask us what sort of animals they were. They would tell us how cool this is. We would have local journalists hunting us down to take a couple of shots and to record some videos. They actually had like live coverage of our trek with the buffaloes across the Carpathians, and we saw how Michel would be visited by someone from Lviv having this conversation about buffaloes, but then about these specific cows and they would try to get him involved into saving other species of animals. We also had a lady from Kyiv who came over, and she wanted to establish a cheese production. So many of these people, they might not participate directly, but they are very actively interested in what's happening, and they get in touch with Michel. And Michel is a very outgoing person. He has a Facebook page, he has his own personal website, and he has lots of volunteers coming over from abroad, because he is one of the few people, probably, who can present his project over on Facebook and attract some international attention. So many people are aware of what he's doing. I'm in no position to say to what extent the local community is interested in reviving the tradition, but at least people got involved. They worked at the farm, they received wages, so they were interested in the remuneration, but they also loved the animals very much, and you could see that somehow it isn't just a job for them. They get involved and they put their heart into it. So this can be checked by asking if anyone else got involved into a similar activity. Did anyone get into rearing buffaloes, or is Michel still a monopolist in the buffalo area? Well, he's got several buffaloes that he kept for himself, but his buffaloes generally are now reared at larger farms across the Transcarpathian region. You can arrive there. They have licenses to sell buffalo milk products, so they've turned it into a proper business. And also part of Michel's buffaloes are now living in the wild. Part of them have been relocated into a reserve in the Odessa region, and some of his buffaloes also live in the Narcissus region in Transcarpathia. So, okay, we can now leave the buffaloes behind and get back to your career as a documentalist. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but if I remember this right, you started out in Babylon 13, and Babylon is probably, next to Docudays, one of the drivers of documentalism in Ukraine following the Maidan. So it was a bright spark that has introduced a huge variety of films that cover all sorts of topics. So can you talk more about your experience with Babylon 13? And as I understand, you studied at Bukovsky's workshop after that. So how did your approaches change as time passed, as you evolved? If you compare the period when you started with Babylon 13 and perhaps the period after Bukovsky's workshop. I have received an education as a journalist. I'm a media person. And so when the Maidan started, I was finishing my education abroad. And as many people, I wanted to contribute somehow. And, you know, I was a professional journalist, so what I could do was to come over and to try my hand at documentary filmmaking. I didn't have experience at the time, but I really wanted to get involved in it. I came back to Ukraine and I got acquainted with Volodymyr Tikhy. I was introduced to him and I showed him one of my works. I made this work as I studied in London in the UK. I had this project called A Drop in the Ocean, and I think the Banda agency worked on it, or at least people working for Banda now, and I shot a video for them about volunteers, about Euromaidan volunteers in London. And so I approached Tikhy with this, and I told him I wanted to get involved. He told me there was no issue. I mean, the Maidan was effectively winding down, but we were still shooting a lot at hospitals, about IDPs, etc. So he told me I should go to a hospital and try and shoot some material. I arrived there, I shot it, I edited it, and he said, "This is a great report, but this is no film, right?" Well, I didn't give up. I re-edited it once more, and he told me this is still a report after my third try. And then at some point, I got into really doubting my ability, to be honest. And then he said, "Okay, drop this. There's no chance you can get it done." I went back to the hospital. I reshot my materials, and this was my first short film under Babylon. At the hospital, they had a wedding between a man who returned from the ATO and his wife. I re-edited it once more, and then Tikhy finally told me this was a film. And probably after that, I finally realized how filmmaking was different to journalism. And I had this opportunity as I was working at Babylon. I had the support of fantastic editors, fantastic camera operators, and I made quite a few films for Babylon at the time, and then I understood that I was lacking education, proper training in this area of activity, and I wanted to have something that would not be focused on the war, and so I traveled to the Odessa Film Festival. I went to a lecture by Sergei Bukovsky, and he spoke about his workshop. And I thought this was my golden opportunity. I joined the workshop, and I have to be honest, it was fascinating for me to be there, to get acquainted with the old school and the new school, because Babylon is more dynamic, it is more contemporary, it is adapted to the newer formats, they work with YouTube, etc. And then Sergei Bukovsky would talk about proper old school, beautiful filmmaking, and it was captivating. So I always warmly recommend everyone to join his workshop. And then when this project came along, we participated in lots of training events, in lots of programs. I personally bought, you know, Sundance courses, whatever. So I was investing actively into self-education. Well, I understand that education is incredibly important, and I wouldn't try to undermine this narrative that's focused on how important training is. But I also think, and there are lots of other people who will share my opinion, there will be lots of discussions about this, do you then get to, I don't know, don't your ideas get parcellated, get spread out too much? You've listened to so much advice from people. You've probably heard a lot of recommendations at pitching events. You've seen your project from the point of view of many different people. So how do you then avoid this uncertainty when you see there are a million ways you could tell your story and you don't remember what you wanted to do with it originally? Did you get overwhelmed at any point after these many stages of international feedback? And how did you manage this? I did get this experience. Our first pitching and training took place in Lisbon. We went there with my producer, and it was a brilliant experience. And it lasts a week, and the pitching takes place on the last day. And then over 5 or 6 days, you go through conversations with many different people. You work in small groups, and you get lots of tutors who work on improving your project. And then at some point on the 5th day, I think I fell into I got a proper fit, you know. I was sitting in the cinema hall and I had these huge tears running down my cheeks, and my producer would tell me, "What's happening?" And I said, "I can't remember what my film is about anymore." So we would have a training event before lunch and then one after lunch. So you come in and people tell you, "You're going to have such a fantastic film about nature, about buffaloes. You probably don't need your main character. Let the buffaloes be your main character." You think, okay, that's nice. And then you have other people telling you, "A single character is boring. You need to make a love story out of it." And then on the next day you're told, "You need to have a single character, get out the girlfriend, get out the buffaloes. You don't need that." So you keep listening to that. You realize that these are people with huge amounts of experience. They are definitely giving you good advice, but the way it all dissonates is mind-blowing. I had a cathartic experience. I cried it over, thank God, and after that I realized that I was the person in charge and I was the one deciding what my film would look like, and it was my task to communicate my idea to the team, to the cameraman, to the editor, to make sure that this was my film, that it didn't belong to anyone else. So all of this feedback is very helpful, but you must not forget that this film belongs to you. Yeah, I can imagine what sort of a colossal amount of internal work you have to undertake, even when, especially if your project is prolonged in time. I can imagine that Babylon was very fast-paced, and journalism is also very fast-paced. You have to produce something very quickly before interest fizzles out to the topic you're working on. And then here, you had to work for 5 years. This is your feature film debut, and you needed to stay focused. And so this is an incredible story. I also wanted to ask you to articulate you said you grasp the difference between reporting and a documentary film, which is an artistic statement. And you also mentioned how you were advised just to keep the buffaloes on screen. And I thought that there's this huge risk of turning your film into a National Geographic feature, you know. So how do you stay away from this objective stance, if it's possible in documentary filmmaking? So where is this watershed for you between journalism and documentary filmmaking as filmmaking? It is difficult for me to answer to that question. I can't come up with a universal understanding of what filmmaking and what journalism is. I think I just get sort of an intuitive feeling of it when I'm working on a project. I got this understanding when I first had to re-edit my film 5 times under Vichy's control. I felt like he was having fun of me, seriously, like he was mocking me. He told me, take a different approach. I took, and he still told me this was wrong. I couldn't understand what was not right. I tried to approach the material so many different ways. I edited so many different ways. But then, when I shot my first unsuccessful film and the second successful film for Babylon, they were both focused on the wedding at the hospital. But the first one was made in such a way that the material itself wasn't really cinematic. It was a wedding which was attended by so many journalists, and there was a huge crowd of people in the room, about 500 people. Everyone was trying to take a shot, and the journalists would give everyone the same interview, telling that we would meet here, and then this and that happened. And I realized that there was no possibility to edit this material into a documentary. And then when we worked on the second wedding, we came alone. We didn't have any interviews on screen, and the characters were pretty shy in front of the camera. So the material itself, the emotion itself that beams through the screen, the emotions of the characters often go to say far more than the characters could ever have said in words. So I think this might be one of the differences, because in journalism you have a clear time limit and you need to try to cram in as much as useful information, the who did what, when, and where, and how. You need to answer all these questions. In filmmaking, you might answer one of the 5 questions, and it still might be interesting if you have a plot, if you have a canvas around it. I think there are more rules in journalism. Yeah, you have to fit a format, right? Yes, that's correct. Filmmaking is, I don't know, more creative, more artistic, I would say. I think it's fair to say that documentary filmmaking, as any sort of artistic statement, requires distance and time. And I think this is what people who are responsible for reforms in filmmaking, they probably find it difficult. It's probably difficult for them to understand that you can work on a single film for 5, 7, 9, 15 years, and to think that it might become better because of that. I guess it might not come as obvious to many people, and it needs to be articulated and explained. And continuing logically, the conversation about your path in documentary filmmaking, we have this question from a viewer. Have you already got plans for your next films? If this isn't a secret, if you can tell us what it's going to be about, and do you wish to step away from portrait filmmaking, because as we have heard, it is quite exhausting, or do you wish to continue making portrait documentary films? I definitely want to continue shooting movies into the future. I have an idea, but it is way too raw, I think, for me to bring it up here. I would like to shoot a film that will have not a single character, but it will be more of a collective story that I would really like to study through the prism of film art. So the next film is probably going to be different. I think it's nice that you might want to search for your own style and your own vision. Oh no, definitely a single film is not enough to do that. You can't demand a person to stick to the same thing forever. I know that you work in SMM, you're a communication officer, and you have also been a line producer for many films. Oh my word! I must have made a big mistake there. Yeah, I am engaged in marketing, but a line producer, that's probably someone else. That must have been someone else, not me. Does your work in marketing bring anything into your lifestyle as a documentary filmmaker? Well, I understand it's probably a financial safety net. And do you see your work as documentary filmmaking? Nah, this is completely different, I would say. Documentary filmmaking is probably something that I'm still learning, that I'm still studying, and marketing is a thing I'm pretty decent at, I would say. And that's which is why I do it. This is not going to be a surprise to anyone, but you know, working in documentary filmmaking and making a living at the same time is difficult. So I've got these two things, two areas of activity that I can combine. They're very interesting, but I wouldn't mix them between them. Yeah, and so this is another comment about internal work, about being able to switch between activities. So, yeah, kudos for that. Thank you very much for this conversation today. Thank you very much to all the viewers who've joined us tonight and have sent in their questions. I would like to remind you that in 7 minutes, access to As Far As Possible will be open online, and you will be able to enjoy it. Please do. And you will also be able to vote for it, to support it. I have to warn you, please please don't postpone rating the film for too long. You have to vote within 4 hours from the moment when you've pressed the play button. So please, don't take too much time to make up your mind. I understand you might need a bit of distance to evaluate what you've just seen, but bear in mind this limitation. We will be meeting you tomorrow at this time. We'll be having a conversation with Semen Moscovy. We'll be talking about Salt from Bonneville. Thank you very much. I would like to wish you a pleasant evening and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.